In this video, we're going to talk about static HTML using the inflation manager. Now, we already have a video around the inflation manager, but just as a recap, step one, register the template with the inflation manager, and then as you need to build up your data, you can then say inflation manager.get, you pass in the data that you want for the key that you have, and then it'll return to you a document fragment containing a bunch of elements that you can add to the container. One additional step to this is that you can recycle existing elements. So in the bottom section, we are doing an update where we're getting a new batch of data and we're getting the elements that's currently in our container, and we still use the get, but in this case we add a third parameter to it, which is the elements that we want to use, and that will actually just re-inflate the current elements. It won't actually create new ones for you. So it'll just update the HTML, be it the attributes or the styling or the textual content based upon what the inflation requires. There's one way that we can do this that actually makes the JavaScript requirements much less. In this example here, we say that we want to see 5 items. The template contains a div that has some translation stuff on it, and then itemized information. It's a bit of a ridiculous example, but I want to show you that you can do the translations and the actual items together. We're going to update this and say I want to use 10 items, so we'll generate 10 random items over here, and you can see that we now have 10 items in the DOM, and I can reduce that down to 3 and say update. So in this case, we're still doing recycling of elements when elements are there. So if I just update, we're not actually getting new elements in, we're just updating the existing elements values. But when I add something that's more than the quantity of elements that I have, then we'll add that difference to it. And if I put in a number that's less than what we have elements for, in other words, the data length is less than the elements we have, it removes the redundant elements from the UI. Another important thing to notice is that even though we're updating the elements, any attributes or styling that you put in as part of your runtime will be removed when you re-inflate that element. So here we have a class list that has the normal list item added to it, but it also has a red which changes the background. And when I update the inflation, that item is removed. So it's important to note that we're not replacing the element, we're just removing all of the markup that you've added during your runtime. So you can have all kinds of conditional bindings on these elements without any fear of it representing the wrong information when the new inflation happens. Let's have a look at how we defined this. The most important part of this whole equation is the HTML, because most of this is actually driven via the HTML. So we have a UL here, and inside of the UL we have a template. And the template uses a syntax that says for.inflate, which means that this is static HTML. There won't be any per item binding updates. It basically generates the HTML, inflates the values, but there's no additional listeners that tries to do anything fancy. So it's a very cheap sort of optimization, and it uses exactly the same syntax as all the other for dot expressions. And then inside we have an li, and we bind to an attribute. So we say the data item has 2 properties. It has a value and it has a caption. So in this case, I'm adding the value to the data-value attribute, and the caption I'm binding to the text content of the div. But additionally, you can also see that we have a translation over here on the attribute and a translation in the div. And this is just to show that translations still work from an inflation perspective. Looking at the JavaScript side, the most important part here is just the data. So we have some random data that we're generating based on the number of items that we want. And then we say this.setProperty data equals data. And as soon as this setProperty data is called, that inflation will happen automatically for you. So if I get a new set of data in and I want to update the UI, basically all I need to do is just call the set property with the new data that came in, and I'm off to the races. However, this is not always true. Sometimes I want to make 2 or 3 changes to existing items on an existing array, but I kind of want to flush that data back to the UI. So how can we do that? I have a partial update that's bound to a button. And in the partial update, I say, give me the data that I currently have. Take the first item and set the value to 100 and set the caption to item 100. And then we call the standard CRS binding data update UI, passing in the binding context ID and the property that we bind against. So when I call this, the inflation will happen again and that item will be updated. Here's our items that we've been rendering. So I'm just going to click partial update, and now you can see item 100. And if we go and look at the data dash attribute, it's 100 as well. An important thing is that on the translation bindings, I have the translation set up in this case ahead of time, so that by the time that the elements are being processed, the translations is in place, and this is just copied over almost in a hard-coded fashion for performance reasons. So you really want to ensure that your translations are there before you do the binding. At my code, you can see I've got a preload where I'm just setting the default number to start off with, saying 5. And then here I'm setting the translations to this. So if I change this to, let's say, caption and save it, we'll go back to the browser, refresh it, and you'll see it has not changed to caption. So to summarize, we have a parent element. In the parent element we have a template. The template has a for.inflate. For each item in the data that we have, we define our binding expressions based on that item. So item.value and item.caption, just like all the other 4 operations does. And this is exactly the same as running the inflation manager manually. It just kind of does that on your behalf. When you change the data property, since we're binding against the data property here, everything will automatically update. But if you want to make individual changes, and then once all the individual changes have been made, you want to go and flush the UI again, you can just use the update UI function.